Welcome to behavioural preferences, how they impact upon remote working. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Michelle McArthur-Morgan, and I'm the founding partner of Jigsaw at Work and creator of the Jigsaw Discovery Tool and behavioural framework. One of my kind of passions in life is that I'm absolutely fascinated with human behaviour. And it's something that for the last 25 years has actually occupied quite a lot of my time. And first of all, I started off from looking at it from the psychological perspective. And then over the last 10 years or so, I've been very much drawn into the learning about researching from the neuroscience perspective of behaviour. So, and it's these two disciplines that I bring together in my work with individuals and teams, helping them to understand more about themselves and each other, so that we can actually start to develop some of the future skills that are needed for the future workplace. And really, you know, up till a few months ago, we talked about very much the skills required for 2030. Now, I think it's more likely to be the skills that we need for our next new norm, whatever that turns out eventually to be. But ultimately, it's all about increasing that self-awareness and that understanding to build stronger and more agile and teams and profitable businesses. So today we are going to cover a few things. We're going to be looking at how behavioural preferences impacts upon the way we experience remote working, the challenges facing remote teams and managers, and ways of maintaining productivity and effectiveness when working remotely. As we go through the webinar, please feel free to put any questions you have in the chat box, and I will do my best to answer the questions as we go through. If we think about our current situation, how many times have you heard recently people say, at least we're all in the same boat? Well, in actual fact, I don't think we are in the same boat. Generalizations about the lockdown will actually mean that we can overlook the fact that people are all different and we all have very different behavioural preferences. And whilst the current situation of working from home may at first appear to be highly desirable by some people, in fact, probably many people in the first couple of weeks, but after 8 long weeks of lockdown, no real end in sight, it's actually starting to take its effect upon people and starting to take its toll. Psychologists are predicting that the pandemic will have a profound effect on people's mental health and well-being for the majority of people, albeit for very different reasons. One factor which impacts very much upon our well-being and productivity is the fact that it's about our self-awareness and understanding of our behavioural preferences. And people, what we find is people who have increased self-awareness and understand about their own behavioural preferences actually tend to be more healthier, mentally healthier, and outperform other people. Just want to think back really to our workplace pre-March 23rd. And if we look at workplaces pre-March 23rd, then really there were 3 different ways of working. We had teams of people working in offices, co-located teams. There were some virtual teams around as well. And there were combined teams who had that combination of both being co-located and having some time where people worked remotely from home, perhaps. Compare that with what we've got today, though. And what we have today is according to the Office of National Statistics, 49.2% of employees are now remote working, compared to just a couple of years ago, in 2018, just 4.4% of people were remote working. Now that's a huge change, and it's one which has been thrust upon us. We didn't ask for it. Many people didn't even actually want it, yet it looks like something which is going to remain for a long time. And probably listening to reports and research being published at the moment organisations are now questioning that need for having a physical office space. And many other organisations are thinking about reducing the physical space, so that although, yes, they may well keep an office as such, that some workers will actually spend most of the time working from home and perhaps just come in maybe one day a week, maybe a couple of days a month, whatever, but the majority of time being spent working from home, working remotely. And at the same time, as the workforce having to adjust to all these challenges and is having to establish that new norm, there is also the huge financial pressures that are on businesses. All this means that we actually need our people to be at the very top of the game, to be at their very, very best. Now, it may or may not come as a bit of a surprise when we start to think about the needs of remote team members. But in actual fact, what we found with the needs of remote team members are very similar to the needs of combined or co-located teams, because ultimately people, excuse me, people are people. And we all have fundamental needs. If those fundamental needs are not satisfied, then that has a negative influence on our well-being and our performance. Some of you may well be aware of David Rock's SCARF model, which looks at the 5 social domains of experience. Now, if these social domains are actually satisfied, if the social domains, the need is actually met, then it produces something known as a reward response in the brain, which releases hormones, which make us feel happy and enable us to do some of our best thinking and our best working. However, when these areas of social experience are not met, they trigger a threat response. When a threat response is triggered, it leads to increased stress levels, feelings of anxiety, and ultimately impacts upon our ability to think as our cognitive processes start to close down and our well-being begins to decline, making it harder for us to work, harder certainly to be at the top of our game where we need to be right now. So if we just take a look at each one and just spend a moment or two considering each of these 5 social domains. Just thinking about the current situation that we're in with the pandemic and remote working. Out of all the domains, status is probably, and I do only say probably, the least affected domain at the moment. Although for some people, perhaps if those that have been made redundant already lost their jobs, then there certainly could be a major negative impact for them on their status. Certainty is the next one, social domain. Now, I'm sure most of you will agree there is very little certainty around at the moment, or at least perceived certainty. It's actually one of those things that we need to work on to create as much certainty as possible for ourselves in our own worlds, because certainty is something which the brain craves for. And when the brain doesn't receive that certainty, then again, huge threat responses are triggered, creating anxiety and stress. And that's one of the reasons partly behind when we saw all the mass panic buying right at the beginning of the kind of the lockdown situation, because there was no certainty and their brains went into mass panic and overdrive. It was a huge, what we call a level 3 threat response that was being controlling people. Their emotional brains were very much in control. So there are things that we can be certain about, and it's about finding those things that we can be certain about within our own worlds and creating that certainty for ourselves, or indeed, if you're a team manager, for your colleagues. Our autonomy and control has also taken a big negative hit at the moment. We feel that this has been done to us. We've been told that we have to stay at home. Until recently, we were told that we could only go out for an hour a day. We've had that autonomy, that choice taken away from us. And for many, many people, they still feel that they have lost that element of control in their lives. So again, this is another area that we need to focus on and look at how can we start to take back some of that control? How can we, perhaps as managers, help our people to feel they have some autonomy and some control? And a simple little thing can be just actually letting your team know that they can control their own working hours. They don't have to work Monday to Friday, 9 till 5. Perhaps, you know, if they're juggling, looking after the children, homeschooling, etc., it might be helpful to them and a great reward actually to them if they can be more flexible with their hours. But that allows them some element of control, some perceived control back in their life. Relatedness. The need for belonging, knowing how we fit into the world, the way in which we connect and relate to each other, again, has taken a huge hit from a negative, a threat response point of view. And the last one of those social domains is fairness. Now, again, this may or may not affect everybody, but fairness, certainly, if you're a key worker and you've had to continue working throughout the whole lockdown situation, perhaps if you in the NHS, a carer, supermarket worker, transport haulage, it might not appear fair to you that you've had to continue working, putting yourself out there on the front line while other people are told to stay at home. Restaurant staff, it just so happens it's my old kind of trade, shall I say, profession. But I'm sure a lot of my colleagues who are still working in the restaurant trade don't feel it's very fair that they are going to be some of the last people to be able to return to work, the last people to open their businesses. So again, creating a huge threat response under fairness. So what we need to think about doing is how can we start to produce some reward responses and override some of the threat responses that we're now actually having, which then raise our levels of stress, impair our cognitive abilities, and impact on our well-being and performance. And the one thing to remember is that a threat response carries a lot more weight than a reward response, meaning that we need several reward responses for every threat response that we receive. So we then looked at, well, what makes an effective team? And if we just look at the top 3 things that make an effective team, no surprises really there: communication, trust, and teamwork. Each team has its own unique challenges, but to be effective, these 3 factors must all be in place. And for these 3 factors to be in place, understanding self and others, our colleagues, our team members, is vital. Understanding our behavioural preferences is at the heart of self-awareness and understanding. And that's really what I want to focus on today. Why should we be self-aware? Well, the way in which we perceive and experience the current situation will be influenced by our behavioural preferences. If we understand more about our behavioural preferences and those of our team members, it can help to pinpoint which areas of our social experience will be the most important to ourselves or our colleagues, the individual. Our behavioural preferences can also help to identify our personal stressors, the things which are most likely to create stress and anxiety in our lives. At the core of behavioural preferences, and certainly when we look at the Jigsaw behavioural framework, there are 3 axes: introversion and extroversion, the way in which we direct and receive our energy; thinking and feeling, the way in which we make our decisions. Do we approach a problem, make a decision using logical, rational thought, or do we actually involve our emotions in that? Intuition and sensing, the way in which we take information in. Are you the type of person that actually can identify and see patterns emerging? Or are you somebody who has to be able to touch, see, hear, feel, taste, taking information in through your five senses? At a very basic level, there are four behavioural preferences. In the Jigsaw behavioural framework, we actually use characters to introduce the behavioural framework to people. And if I just give you a very quick overview of the four behavioural characters' preferences. Our first character we call Eva Reddy. Now, Eva Reddy is quite a direct, blunt-speaking individual, focused, driven. It's all about achieving results, decisive and fast-paced person. Then we come to Rayo Sunshine. Rayo Sunshine loves novelty. It's all about enjoyment. It's all about seeking out those opportunities, having some fun. Rayo Sunshines like to be different. They get bored easily. They can be quite talkative at times, can be quite sociable individuals, quite creative problem solvers. And one thing that we need to be always remember about Rayo Sunshine is they need to be close to the energy, where there is some energy. Our third character is Carey. Carey is very much the team player. Caring, loyal, helpful, supportive type individual. Can be a little bit prone to worrying. Does like to actually operate within the familiar. He likes familiarity. He likes to be within the comfort zone. And one thing we need to just be conscious of is carers don't like confrontation. They will always try and avoid confrontation wherever possible. Our last character is Mr. Huey Blue. Now, Mr. Huey Blue, he likes order, he likes structure, he likes processes, he likes systems, routines. He dislikes the unknown. He tends to be quite cautious and risk averse. And in Mr. Huey Blue's world, there's a right way of doing things and a wrong way of doing things, but there's no in-between way of doing things. So just have a quick reflection on yourself and try and identify yourself and perhaps some of your colleagues. Now, it's true to say we are not just one character. We are all a combination of those four behavioural preferences, but we do tend to have a dominant preference or preferences that actually we tend to operate from for a high percentage of the time. So just think about which of those kind of characters is probably the best description for you. I'll just give you a moment just to kind of have a quick reflect on that. Okay. So just want to move on now and just look at the 9 challenges of remote working. I'm not saying these are the only challenges, but these are kind of 9 challenges that I've kind of come across and seen keep cropping up and people keep talking to me about. The 9 challenges of remote working. First of all, differences in communication styles, and I'm going to come back to that in a moment and pick up on that. Lack of structure, from going to that kind of the structure of having the office and colleagues and kind of routines and ways of doing things, to finding yourself at home and that structure no longer there. Not having the right tools, because again, we get so used and take for granted all the tools and equipment that we have in the office. And then again, we find ourselves working at home, perhaps from the kitchen table. We haven't got that big printer there that will duplicate everything and staple it and sort it. We have a little small printer perhaps at the side of us. Distrust. Often through lack of transparency, we can't actually see what's going on around us. We miss out on those kind of conversations that we overhear, that body language as we see somebody walking through the office. The environment can be so much more distracting for some people at home, especially at the moment when children aren't at school, we're homeschooling, perhaps there's 2 or 3 people all trying to work from home at the same time in very different roles. differences in response times, things, the different ways we prioritize things, what I perceive as being urgent and must need to be done and responded to straight away may be very different to what somebody else perceives to be the most important urgent things to do. Missing that office culture, not having that office culture around us, not being able to kind of have those conversations with colleagues, those off the cuff type conversations. Managing budgets can be another challenge, and scheduling meetings, especially if people are working flexible hours, trying to find a time that suits everybody can be quite a challenge. So if we just take a look back at some of those behavioural preferences, and we can immediately start to see how the challenges are likely to be influenced by those behavioural preferences. And I just picked a couple of examples out. And if we take the challenge of lack of structure. Now for Mr. Huey Blue, lack of structure could be a real source of stress, a real challenge. Whereas for Ray or Sunshine, who actually thrives on freedom and flexibility, we would actually think that an unstructured environment would be really great for him. And it can be. However, this is where self-awareness is really key and important. If Ray or Sunshine overplays his strength of being flexible and allows his strengths of being inquisitive and the liking for novelty to take hold, then he may well flounder and performance could well start to decrease because he could well get drawn into something could just catch his attention and he could start going off on tangents. So that's this self-awareness bit, while on the surface you may say, well, actually, Ray or Sunshine, they love freedom and flexibility. They do, but in order to perform well, they still need an element of structure. Another example we could consider here is the challenge of having a lack of office culture. For carers, the loss of having that sense of belonging, being part of a team, being able to relate on a day-to-day basis with colleagues, catching up in the kitchen as you make those cups of coffee, again, can be a big source of stress and anxiety for the carer. Whereas for an Eva Reddy, it's likely to have little impact on them. The Eva Reddy is not such a people person as the carer is. For Eva Reddy's, their focus is on achievement, success, getting the job done. Whereas for carers, their focus is around those relationships. They are people. I mentioned earlier, the first challenge was communication because of the different communication styles. Now, in actual fact, communication is a whole topic in itself and perhaps a webinar for another week. The important thing to remember is that each behavioural preference has their own preferred style of communication. In my experience of working with organisations, large and small, across many different sectors, communicating effectively is one of the biggest challenges they have. And the thing that also amazes me is we communicate all day long, every day of our lives, yet we still can get it so wrong for so much of the time. One of the biggest mistakes we make is that we spend time thinking about what we want to say, but not how we should say it. Choosing the words carefully, words that will speak to the individual behavioural preferences and engage the individuals. But more of that another time. So now just moving on to ways that we can actually start to stay happy, healthy and productive, even if you've got that toddler clinging to your knees, or in my case, it's one very, very clinging dog who usually is sitting at my feet. Today, he's not, fortunately, but usually you would hear little snoring going on in the background as the dog is sleeping under the desk, but not today. So before we look at behavioural preferences, I want to start just by considering how people with a preference for extroversion and introversion are likely to be experiencing remote working. In a recent study, which consisted of a group of extroverts and introverts, and they were actually asked to spend a whole week engaging in some of the higher level extrovert typical behaviours. So being talkative, being sociable, being out there, putting themselves out. At the end of the week, extroverts expressed feelings of enhanced well-being. They were energised. They loved it. They'd found the whole experience very energising and rejuvenating. Whilst on the other hand, the introverts reported feeling tired and irritable. In the current situation of enforced lockdown, it's now the extroverts who are having to adapt their behaviour and will likely experience feelings of decreased well-being in the coming weeks and months. In the typical office situation, we often hear how extroverts and the extroversion preference is actually favoured. Extroverts get noticed more. Extroverts are the ones who get selected for things, and the introverts can be overlooked quite easily. So we often hear people talk about having the extrovert advantage. Now we're starting to hear people talk about the introvert advantage, because for many of the introverts who actually require low levels of social engagement, adapting to the lockdown has been a little easier and is not having such an adverse effect on the well-being. So just think about your own introversion or extroversion preference, and how do you support them whilst you are working remotely? What do you do for yourself? If you manage other people, what do you do to encourage them to exercise their introversion or extroversion preferences? When considering the best way to support an individual, we need to remember to take into account, are they more introvert or more extrovert? Where does their preference lie? Where do they get that energy from? How do they direct that energy? Is their energy directed internally as it is with the extroverts? Do they recharge their batteries internally? Or do they need that social interaction to be able to draw in the energy from the external world? But introversion and extroversion is only part of the picture. We need to think about the behavioural preferences. Now, our Eva Reddy character I introduced you to earlier works best when they have full control and autonomy over their work and over their schedules. They love being left to their own devices. However, a challenge that we've noticed for the Eva Reddys when working remotely can be in staying intellectually stimulated, feeling challenged, sufficiently challenged, and having that real sense of achievement. Because achievement is something which is a key driver to the Eva Reddys. So they need to have and experience that whole sense of achievement. So some of the strategies that we've kind of thought about for the Eva Reddys is, first of all, keep moving forward. Get connected to, be part of, find a meaningful project, something that has got a real sense of purpose, something that really drives you. Search out projects which are more challenging, which are perhaps more intellectually stimulating, and get involved with them. Avoid dwelling on repetitive tasks. Eva Reddys are not great with repetitive tasks. Avoid dwelling on those repetitive tasks. Get them out of the way, get them done. They have to be done, do them, and move on. Get back to that challenging project. Set yourselves targets and goals to perform against, something to measure yourself against. Get organised with a dedicated workspace. Eva Reddys are brilliant. You tell them what needs to be achieved, you let them get on with it, and they will do it on condition that they have the resources which they need in order to do that job. So for Eva Reddy's themselves, they need to get a dedicated workspace where they have everything around them. They have the resources they need. And lastly, for the Eva Reddy's, they need to think about remembering to switch off, actually force themselves to switch off. Eva Reddy's tend to be workaholics at the best of times. And if there is little or no differentiation between work and home, then there's a high risk of not switching off and relaxing. So make sure that you move to a separate room on an evening. Make sure you separate out work from home. Otherwise, perhaps Eva Reddy's can find themselves on that pathway to burnout. Thinking about our friend Ray of Sunshine. Now, Ray of Sunshine, variety is the spice of life for a Ray of Sunshine. So they may well find working from home actually pretty tough going. Being confined to the home for prolonged periods of time, especially when we could only go out for an hour a day. At least now they have that option to go out several times a day and can spend more time out and about. But being confined for prolonged periods of time would be really quite challenging and something that the Ray of Sunshine would most certainly not enjoy. So the challenge for Ray of Sunshines in remote working is actually finding ways of having fun, of still socializing, and yet still having, whilst enjoying that freedom and flexibility that I spoke about earlier, still having that element of structure. So some of the strategies that they may wish to consider: get an accountability buddy, somebody that you are accountable for, somebody that will hold you to the standards, stop you from slipping, dropping behind, missing deadlines, somebody that will make you keep on target, on project. Reward yourself. Ray of Sunshine should think about rewarding themselves for those tasks that they consider to be quite mundane, administrative type tasks, and not great energizers for the Ray of Sunshine. So reward yourself when you've completed some. Or perhaps if you have a great insight, solve a problem. Again, think of a suitable reward. It doesn't have to be much. It could be something as simple as perhaps going out for a walk, meeting a friend in the park, social distancing rules observed, of course. Reach out to people. If you're feeling lonely, call or video call somebody. Why not even use your new portal? Ray of Sunshines like things that are new. They like to be amongst the first people to have the latest technology, the latest gadget. So the new portal, Facebook portal's just come out. I'm sure, and I'm certainly amongst my Ray of Sunshine friends, I know several of them were the very first people to get the new Facebook portal, pre-ordered the lot. So reach out, don't wait for a reason to call them, other people, just get in touch. No reason other than to have a chat and perhaps have a bit of a rant. Allow some distractions. Distractions are okay if managed well. Make sure you add some variety in there. Find exciting and different things to do. When you get a mental block, stop doing whatever you're doing. Do something different, something exciting, something that you find energizing. It could be just taking the dog for a walk, kicking a ball about in the back garden with the kids. But one thing to be sure is to make sure that you keep taking those regular breaks to include that variety. Lastly, create yourself some deadlines. Without the busyness of having all your colleagues around you, people going backwards and forwards, seeing people doing things, people asking you things, it can be very easy to lose that whole sense of urgency. So perhaps you invest in some software, some project management tools, and give yourself some deadlines. Carey. With caries are very that they're great team players, very people orientated. They like being around colleagues. They like being part of that team. They like helping other people, collaborating with other people, supporting other people when they can. And the challenge for careers in remote working really comes from that lack of human contact. Carer is a people person. They like to be support and they like to support other people. So carers will be missing that opportunity to talk to colleagues informally. And losing those in-person connections is going to be quite difficult and challenging for them. So some of the strategies that carers can consider: use video calls or phone calls over emails every time. Building rapport is really important to a carer, and it's something that they need, that kind of FaceTime with people. And if they can't do that in person, then the next best thing is the likes of a video call. There was actually some research published last week that said using video rather than in-person meetings and for conversations didn't impede the rapport building process significantly, as it's still possible for most people to be able to accurately read facial expressions. Be social while social distancing. Use technology. Set up a virtual lunch with a colleague. Attend a virtual yoga class. Replicate those kitchen meetings. Now, we all know that most of us, when we've been in a meeting at work, in the office, when we come out of that meeting, we either walk down the corridor with a colleague, having a good old chat, sharing our thoughts about the meeting, or we go into the kitchen and make ourselves a coffee, and again, share our thoughts about the meeting. And for carers, they can miss having that opportunity. So why not, at the end of a virtual meeting, when the meeting's finished, pick up the phone and speak to a colleague. Have a conversation, share those conversations, those thoughts, just as you would do in the real workplace, the live workplace. Cut yourself some slack. Carers, although they like to help and support other people, they actually have a tendency to be very hard on themselves. So show yourself some kindness and compassion. Take time out, make time for yourself. Ask for help when you need it. Again, carers are very good at offering that help, but rarely do they're more reluctant to ask for help. They don't want to impose on other people. So make sure that you do reach out and ask for help. Offer a listening ear. As I've said, carers are very good at being there and helping, supporting other people. But remember, carers, by doing that, it actually helps you to rejuvenate yourself as you go through the day, because it helps to re-energize you. You're doing something that is playing to your preference. Get super organized. Again, it's all about having that dedicated workspace and letting other members of your household know when you're at work, and that when you're at work, they should only approach you if it's a real emergency. Try and get rid of as many of those distractions as possible during the work time to stay focused for longer. Mr. Huey Blue. For Mr. Huey Blue, his organisational skills are one of his key strengths. Self-discipline, motivation, all mean that actually working from home shouldn't present too much of an issue for him. However, the challenge, and there's always a challenge, the challenge will be coping with the less than perfect systems. Dealing perhaps with colleagues who are working flexible, different kind of working times to themselves. Working with other people who are perhaps working to different standards to themselves. Remember, I said in Mr. Huey Blue's world, there's a right way, there's a wrong way, and the right way tends to be their way. They're not the most flexible of people, so this can present a challenge to them. So strategies that Huey Blue can consider: create again a dedicated workspace. Huey Blues thrive in having order and correctness, so Balancing a laptop on your knee while sitting on the settee will not work for a Huey Blue. Choose your spot and do what you can to set it up as a proper office. Get yourself an office setup, a proper office. Stick to your routines. If you usually start work at 8 a.m. and it still suits you to do that, then continue to do so. If you usually stop for lunch at 1, continue to do so. Let other members of your household know your routine. Nothing irritates a Huey Blue more than constant interruptions. So get those down to a minimum. Let other members of your household know when you are at work, and again, that you prefer not to be disturbed unless it was a real emergency. Get organised. Be clear about the reporting structures, the channels of communication, how things are going to be done, the systems to be followed, the processes to be followed, and clarify anything that you are unsure about. And lastly, discuss your concerns. If you have any specific concerns regarding working from home, for example, bring them to your manager's attention and work together with them. Try to be a little bit more flexible and open to find a solution, to work your way through whatever the challenge may be, to find a solution. These are unprecedented times, and we don't all have the answers. And the only way we're going to actually do that is by working together. Perhaps even speak to a colleague, a ray of sunshine colleague. Ask them how they would do it. Ask them for some ideas, because they're the creative problem solvers. They might think of something that you would never ever think about doing. But do you know what? When you put it into practice, it may well work. So I've tried to give you an insight into the behavioural preferences and the things that they can do better to support the behavioural, either your own or colleagues' behavioural preferences when working remotely. If you're a team manager, think about how well do you know and understand the behavioural preferences of your individual team members? How do you provide the support for each of those team members to accommodate their individual preference needs? And what else could you do to better support their needs and enable them to maintain their health, happiness, and performance? A final thought. It takes more than a good Wi-Fi connection and technology to work remotely effectively. You also need to be aware of those behavioural preferences and those of your colleagues. Hopefully, I provided some food for thought about how you and your colleagues could organise your environment and get the level of get the level of social interaction you need to maintain your well-being and to help you work more effectively as a remote team. The best thing we can do right now as we move into the next norm is share our experiences and learn from one another. Before I take a few of your questions, just want to tell you about an upcoming event. On the 30th of June, we're doing a virtual Jigsaw Discovery experience where we'll be diving deep into the behavioural preferences. The participants at that event will complete their own personal profiles and behavioural maps and get a workbook which is going to be jam-packed full of practical information, things that you can use and do each and every day at work or at home to help build those stronger relationships, communicate more effectively, and enhance teamwork and overall performance. One last thing just to remember, that I have to remember to say before we leave today and go and move on to questions is, over the next couple of days, we will be sending out a recording or a link to a recording of the webinar, so you can refer back to it. So really, if there are any questions now, I am very happy to take any questions you have got. If anybody thinks of any questions after the event, then again, I am very happy for you to get in touch with me, drop me an email, contact me on LinkedIn. You know where to get hold of me, and I'm happy to we can set up a Zoom call if you think you'd like to have a Zoom call. You can easily schedule a 15-30-minute Zoom call, no problem at all, and just talk through some of the challenges perhaps you've got, and perhaps how thinking about behavioural preferences could perhaps help you and your team. So, are there any questions or anything from anybody? Interesting sessions. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Barbara. Thank you, Donna. One question, are there any quick, easy activities a team could do remotely to understand each other's preferences? One of the things you could do remotely, a lot of it comes down to communication, in fairness, and there is nothing wrong with talking. I'm quite happy for you to kind of use some of the things that I've said today about those 4 behavioural preferences, and perhaps you could introduce those 4 behavioural preferences to team members. Just talk about the actual, the different preferences people have, how some people prefer to have much more people persons, other people prefer to be able to spend more time working alone, other people prefer to be part of the team, and get people to share their preferences, give them some time to think about how they can actually, what they prefer, basically, what do they do to support their own preferences for the way they prefer to work? How have they got their work organized? How have they got a dedicated workspace? Get them to share what they're doing, get them to share then what they think other people could perhaps do, how you could all support one another within the team. Have a discussion around meetings. Do you want to set up, just have formal meetings, online meetings, maybe once a week, once a month, whatever regularity you actually feel is necessary and appropriate? Or would they like to have those informal? I know plenty of teams at the moment, and literally 10 o'clock every morning, everybody who wants to logs on to Zoom and they have 10 minutes and they all sit and they have a cup of coffee and a chat and a catch up. It's not about work. It's actually, about real life. It's catching up with people as individuals. So it's really that one of the easiest things you can do is just having those conversations and facilitating those conversations with people. So I think that's lots of thanks coming in, great reminders on different behavioural preferences during this time. I think the thing to remember is people are people and we've still got the same needs. It's finding ways of satisfying those needs now that we're not all as a collective coming together on a regular basis. It's thinking about, for some people, they'll be loving it. Mr. Huey Blues won't have as many interruptions. They won't have colleagues constantly email, well, they may still get emails, but they won't have colleagues constantly kind of coming across to them and speaking to them and interrupting them. They can choose not to open their emails at certain times if they want to focus on doing a project. But for other people, they'll actually be missing that social interaction, missing having that cup of coffee in the kitchen with a colleague or just catching up with them. So thank you very, very much for listening and for tuning in. And as I say, if anybody does want a conversation, a private conversation, you are more than welcome to contact me. Thank you very much.